Okay, so welcome to the Pilipinx-American Stories podcast. We are here to better understand aspects of the Pilipinx-American diaspora. We cover topics like, but are not limited to, community, history, and Pilipinx-American culture. And I'm your host, Alfredo. And today's guest, we have Emily representing New York. What's up, Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily. It's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so before we go into the topic, can you give a little bit of an intro of what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a doctoral student in at NYU, study sociology of education. I'm originally from California, though. I grew up um, in West Covina. I spent actually my whole life in LA County, so I spent my undergrad years and I did my master's at UCLA as well. I studied Asian American studies. I did an education studies minor and a concentration in Filipino American studies. So when I came to New York to do my PhD in sociology of education, it basically just like changed my life and like how I um, thought about race and ethnicity and like what it means to be Filipino American. Um, so yeah, so I basically started out my PhD, pretty much being the only Asian American in the room, which is something that I'm like very not used to. And so I thought about, I could only imagine what it's like to be Asian American or Filipino American in a place outside of California, even in New York, which is probably like the biggest shocker for me. So, and that's something I basically experienced, being in the Filipino American community here, like for instance, being part of Unipro New York. And so that basically informs like why I do the research that I do, which is on like the experiences of Filipino American college students and like how like what are their experiences for those that grew up here, and also like how do they think about race and like their ethnicity and things like that.
Ooh, and that goes on to the topic that we have for today. It's basically the differences and similarities between West Coast Filipinos and East Coast. And considering you're from the West Coast and currently living in the East Coast right now, you're in a very interesting position because you've seen both sides. And you
Mhm.
actually did your dissertation on this, so can you talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, so the dissertation's still in progress. I have basically done a ton of interviews at this point. I'm at over 40. But I've interviewed current and like recent alum Filipino American college students who go to school in the New York metropolitan area. So that includes New York City, Long Island, and northern New Jersey. Basically asking them pretty much their experiences growing up, also their experiences in college, and like how do they think about what it means to be Filipino American in New York or New Jersey, and like what do they think about like the differences between the East Coast and other parts of the U.S. So yeah.
And what was your specific like experience like being there? Like how's it different than say living as a Filipina American like in LA or just like the West Coast in general?
Yeah. That's a great question. I feel like it's been the biggest difference, honestly, is just like not being recognized as Filipino. Most people don't even know what Filipinos are, and it doesn't help that I'm also like, I guess I'm racially ambiguous, so people just assume I'm whatever, and uh, that might be going off topic here, but like the biggest, like for me, the biggest culture shock, for instance, is probably like being viewed as an Asian American or as someone who is like not really. Whereas, like for instance, in California, like people would talk to me in Spanish all the time. Like I just grew up with that, like being racialized as like Latina, for instance, um, and that doesn't really happen in New York. People, yeah, and then people tend to actually group Filipinos with other Asian Americans, which is just like a huge shocker for me. It's probably one of the biggest culture shocks, actually. Whereas like in California, Filipinos are like the largest Asian American group, and that's definitely not the case in New York. So, um, yeah, so people either one don't know about who we are, or they just like overgeneralize us. Um, and again, for me, the most shocking difference is like not seeing Filipinos as this like lower, quote unquote, like ethnicity comparing to other Asian Americans.
That is a little wild because wait, so the population density of or the population in general of Filipinos over in the East Coast specifically, where yeah, it's not that much, is it?
It's not. So, at least according to Wikipedia, when I look up the numbers, there's about like 100,000 Filipino Americans. So, even though there are Filipino ethnic enclaves in the area, so mainly in Queens and Jersey City, it's so much smaller than the overall density of these areas in general. So, again, for instance, like New York has about 100,000 Filipino Americans. The population of New York City is 8.4 billion. So, it's very, very tiny.
What the heck? Okay, so that's actually a little wild because for I just looked up the
Sorry, did I say
numbers right
billion?
now,
I
but
mean
for San
million.
Diego specifically, it's almost 200,000.
Yeah,
And then for all of New York, it's just like it's just barely touching six digits.
yeah.
That's pretty wild. But you also okay, so what the main thing that you brought up that was like pretty interesting, or well, the whole being grouped in as just like a general Asian American rather than
Mhm,
being identified like as Filipino, like what does that actually feel like? Because over here on the West Coast, we already know how it is.
mhm.
You were part of a Filipino org back like in college and everything. So was I, and it's like it's very apparent when you see someone that's Filipino. It's like, hey, what's up? I know you, or like
Yeah.
I might know you or something, or you might be family. But over there, it's like just general like Asian American identity.
It hmm, it depends. I think for me, I still get really excited when I see another Filipino, even though it's like it's still hard to like for us to even recognize each other. Like I've definitely had that experience. Um, but I feel like so for instance, one thing that really shocks me, for instance, is like the lack of Filipino like fraternities, for instance. So I've met people that were like part of Asian fraternities and sororities, and I was like, wait, what? Like, like it just really, it's honestly mind blowing to like see, like even though there's these Filipino clubs, there's just like not as much like diversity in these clubs because, as much as people, enjoy organizing, there isn't much diversity in how these organizations like occur. They're mostly social, and then like more the political like organizations are like outside of the university.
Wait, so generally so there are like Filipino clubs like in New York or just like in
Mhm.
the East Coast in general, but it's the population is not too much, right? It's not like compared to I shouldn't like be comparing, but it's like it's not as much as like a West Coast like Filipino org, right?
It actually depends. But yeah, so that was like another surprising thing I found in my research is that like in um a lot of these colleges, like Filipino orgs are probably one of the largest organizations. So yeah, so it's like they're large for their schools, but then um in terms of membership, no, they're still it depends. Yeah, they're probably smaller than like your average like organization in California, but yeah, but they mostly are like smaller orgs, and so they're more likely, not more likely, but from what I've seen and what I've heard from interviews, they're more likely like social. And they try to do cultural things, but it's usually limited to like food and like Filipino American History Month and those things.
That's so like I don't even know how to begin because like over here you're like so spoiled with a lot of because a lot of the orgs over here are rooted in or in like in California
Hmm.
specifically, like a lot of them are rooted in like politics. A lot of them are rooted in organizing, especially the ones like in the Bay Area and like SoCal and everything.
Right.
So just hearing, well, I'm pretty sure like you had that. I mean, you even mentioned it. Like you had like a lot of culture shock when you started like getting like down with these interviews and everything, right?
Hmm.
How does like I don't even know where to begin with that. It's just like an interesting take on things. But like, do you know like any of the origins of like some of these organizations and everything?
Um, I mean, not really. I feel like they're more just like I feel like the origin is probably not as like political. But I also feel like at the same time, there might be a little bit of misremembering of like even our origins in California. So, for instance, even though like the Asian American movement was very prominent in like in San Francisco, like for instance, like UCLA, our org, Samang Filipino was actually started as a social organization, or like even ethnic studies, for instance, like whereas people like protested and like fought for their, really fought for the right to have like a school of ethnic studies, like in at UCLA, they kind of just like followed what they were doing in NorCal, and they didn't necessarily, um, really struggle for these institutions to exist. Um, yeah. And then so in the East Coast, even though there are these social organizations, they're actually very, very organized. Like they have, conferences and um like something that I noticed that I really appreciate is that a lot of these schools actually do collaborate with each other versus like in California, because we're so far apart and because these orgs are too big, there isn't that much of a need to really connect with like, other Filipino orgs that are in the area. Like I feel like, for instance, Find, which is like the East Coast version of SC Pasa, like they're very organized in terms of like, having these different districts, which are also like mini versions, or basically also again SC Pasa again, but in specific to different states or areas. So like for instance, in New York, there's District 3, so that's again linking schools in Long Island, New York City, and northern New Jersey. So, so these schools are very much in contact with each other. I'm losing my train of thought here. I'm sorry. um, but yeah, so there's that. But then I guess there's like a huge lack of like the institutional knowledge. So there's like a huge lack of like Asian American studies. And from my experience going into these Asian American spaces, they're very predominantly East Asian. Maybe there's more Southeast, I mean, sorry, there's more South Asian or Desi representation, and like a handful of Southeast Asians. But um, like for me as a Filipino, it feels very like predominantly East Asian. So we kind of like do our own thing. Um, but yeah.
But that also has to do with like the immigration
Hmm.
like patterns and everything. Like Filipinos didn't really like primarily since like California's like right there, it's way closer to the Philippines and everything. So
Hmm.
most of them did start coming to the West Coast. But like, do you know any of the history for like immigration like in New York?
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned that because I think that's like a huge thing, as to why people outside of California view, West Coast Filipinos the way they do. It's very much um, like they know that narrative of like these earlier migration patterns, but there isn't much awareness of like the current, or like more contemporary waves of migration. So, for instance, um, like yeah, like so people just like assume that people on the West Coast are like third generation, fourth generation, and I'm like, I've only known like probably like less than 5 people that are like multi-generational. Like we're not all like that, you know. But in the East Coast, on the other hand, like I've actually met a good number of people that migrated like really early, like parents that migrated in like the 1950s, where they were like really forced to like assimilate, but they resisted that as much as they could, and that's why Fawn's like New York Metropolitan New York chapter is the thing, which is also an org that I'm part of. But so there are some earlier like waves of migration, but they're just like not as prominent because I feel like New York is just so diverse, basically, that it's really hard to acknowledge all of its diversity. Um, like yeah, like the immigrant groups of the earlier eras are so much larger than like the Filipinos that have been here for decades. But other than that, like a lot of something that I found in my research and just from meeting, or yeah, just from like meeting people in the area is that a lot of their parents came in as nurses like after 1965, like through like an actual like what's it called? Like an actual agency that like links um that like recruit that actively recruits nurses in the Philippines to like work in areas that have nursing shortages. And so yeah, and so that's how a lot of people have come to work in all over New York City, including Long Island, even the Bronx. Actually, I never have met Filipinos from the Bronx until I was doing these interviews, for instance. And yeah, so they're in pockets of New York City, but a lot of them literally needed that connection to come to the U.S. But with that said, it's also very different in that, like, because they're coming in through these agencies, like they have their degrees honored, whereas like, um, in California, or what people talk about in like education research, like Filipinos um, often come to the U.S. with their degrees not being honored. So, for instance, um, like I know someone who came to the U.S. and like their mom was like a doctor, and now they ended up becoming just like a language interpreter instead of like even working in the medical field. So I think that's also really important to consider.
You've read Empire of Care before, right?
Hmm.
God, like the whole I think you just nailed it on the head about the whole like immigration thing, especially the agency part.
Yeah.
Like I just remember the whole like the I don't remember what the actual like the full name of it is, but it's like the HI visas that are were helping a lot of like
Hmm.
Filipino nurses getting over to places like Chicago, New York, and all that, and now they're just like a lot of them just started settling there because of like the better pay and everything. And you also touched upon the whole fact that like some of those people that did immigrate here, it's like it's very different in that sense because like you
Hmm.
said they weren't honored when it came to their degrees, and now they're just kind of like doing stuff. Do you think that's like part of the reason why a lot of like Filipinos on the West Coast started organizing so early?
Um, I think it's a mix of things actually, but I think yeah, that could make more sense. It makes sense in that, thinking about socioeconomic status, I see a huge difference. Um, that's not to say that there aren't working class Filipinos in New York, but I've found that those communities are very, very separate. Um, so, for instance, like I'm sure there are undocumented immigrants in New York, but it's just so much harder. Um, there's just so much less visibility, especially in the Filipino community. Like when people think about undocumented immigrants, they don't think about other Asian Americans, let alone Filipinos. Like there's this assumption that all the Philams in New York are like second generation. Yet at the same time, there's like the assumption that all Filipinos in the West Coast are like later generations when there's actually like continued migration. But the thing with the thing about New York though is that there probably is continued migration. Like I actually have had the chance to interview a handful of 1.5 generation immigrants, but it's just so much less common, or if it is more common, they're like not in these like more prominent like Phil Am like organizations, or even in the college scene. It's just very different. But yeah, and then with that said, like more of the recent immigrants or like undocumented immigrants are actually OFWs, so like migrant workers, and so it's very different from like a 1.5 generation Filipino who like doesn't have citizenship or who is like undocumented. So that's like a huge difference that I've seen.
Wait, so just touching on your dissertation again, did
Hmm.
you, when you were doing these interviews, you were basically taking it case by case, right? Because
Yeah.
the way it sounds, or at least the way this direction's going, you can't really lump like East Coast Filipinos and West Coast Filipinos as its own thing. Like
Hmm.
everyone in a sense is like very different. Because
Yep.
for me personally, like my story and like my background and everything, I'm 1.5. I immigrated like back in the 90s with my family and everything.
Hmm.
But like you were born in the West Coast, right?
Yes.
So it's like there's not it's not weird or anything, but it's like it's just interesting
Yeah.
taking it case by case. So like what else have you encountered that's like very different and not so generalized that people might think?
Um, yeah, so I think actually to kind of summarize thinking about these differences between like East Coast, West Coast is that I have it written down here. Um, Basically, what I'm seeing is that people are conflating these regions, like East Coast versus West Coast, or like no coast even, versus like that's being conflated like with like different waves of migration. So that's kind of like what I talked about earlier. Like people assume that if you're from the West Coast, you're probably like your parents aren't immigrants or something. Like because like or yeah, like the idea that like someone's grandparent could be like a third generation Filipino. Like that means that that the grandchildren are like fifth generation. And like I can't even imagine. Like that's like that's probably really really rare, you know. Um, there's also the conflation of like urban versus suburban. So I think that's kind of something that I probably had as a misconception in my own head before even coming to New York. Like I assumed that New York would be very much like LA in terms of like political organizing, and I've learned the hard way that that's definitely not the case. It's very different. Um, and then also the real difference is really thinking about people who grew up in like large Filipino communities or like ethnic enclaves versus those who didn't grow up in a large Filipino American community. So that's how people that's like another huge way in which people tend to separate like East Coast being Filipino in the East Coast versus being Filipino in the West Coast. Like there's the assumption that like just because you know just because there's like Seafood City and like so much like Jollibee, you know, restaurants in parts of California, they assume that like everyone has that experience. Whereas like there's literally also Jollibee in New York. There's also one in Manhattan now, um, and you know, so there's like yeah, so like there are communities in New York. There's not as many though, but then there's just the assumption that like you know because someone's outside of California that like they're missing out um on being immersed in the culture whereas like even in our communities like there's a huge diversity of us like even in my own family for instance like I'm the only one well first of all I'm the only one with a college education at this point like my siblings are still in college they're still in community college but like so that's like a huge thing too given that like I'm like a grad student but also like because they're in community college they don't have access to ethnic studies or like the same things that I was exposed to at UCLA. So yeah, so there's that as well.
There's so many differences, but from what I've experienced just through living life and everything, there's a lot
Mhm.
of similarities that do bring Filipinos like on the East Coast, West Coast, no coast, and like in the South, like a lot. Like the first time I met you, like I mean, we bonded over like West Coast stuff. Like I don't remember how that conversation went, but it was just like, oh, West Coast, West Coast. Like
Yeah.
we had like that kind of understanding. But I'm pretty sure, like especially with our group of friends and everything,
Hmm.
there's a lot of similarities that we can see. So like when you were doing your interviews for your dissertation, like were what kind of similarities did you see from like the people that you interviewed? Well, I mean, first of
Yeah.
all, did you just when you were interviewing and everything, were they the people that you interviewed, were they specifically only on the East Coast?
Yes. So everyone I've interviewed, the one thing they all have in common is that they have gone to undergrad in the New York area, New York City or like northern New Jersey. Um,
Hmm.
So whereas like I mean I didn't go to college. I didn't go to undergrad in New York, but I feel like that was like the one thing I made sure was like very important and I prioritized, you know, since I'm studying education, I wanted to see like what was the role of education in all this. So I've limited it as much as I could to current undergraduate students. But yeah, I found a lot of similarities for a lot of the interviews actually. Like for instance, like the people who grew up in Queens, like they had um like I felt like I could really relate to like their experiences being in such a diverse area. Um so there's that, but let's see. Um also um I felt like I could relate to a handful of my interviewees who are just like who have become more radicalized coming to college, whether it is through being involved in an organization or not. So that was something I was also very mindful of in doing my interviews, and is that first of all, um, not every college has a Filipino org. So I've actually interviewed a handful of students who you know, are involved, but they had to be involved outside of the school, or they find community through Twitter, actually. So some folks have found my study through Twitter, and like I literally had no connection. Um, and then yeah, but also I interviewed folks that are like super involved in their orgs and that they have like leadership roles, and so um, I made sure to capture some of those differences, and I felt like I could relate really to those who, um, you know, really want to learn more about their culture and learn more about their history. Um, it's just it's just hard because they don't really have access to that kind of education, basically. And so I guess that's where the differences come in. Um, yeah, yeah.
What do you mean in terms of access? Like they don't really have like that same education to get, or they don't have like those kind of resources to help them like
Um,
self-educate, or they don't really have the mentors to help them out.
yeah. Oh, that's a good question, actually. Um, I would say like definitely ethnic studies is like not it's not really there. Um, and even for the few schools that have Asian American studies, it's not really like a Filipino American studies or I think there's like one school where they have like a Filipino studies minor, but it's only taught by one professor. And so the exposure to like different types of perspectives is very limited. And yeah, and like that Filipino studies minor isn't the same as like thinking about Asian American studies or even ethnic studies as a whole. It's Filipino language and then like Filipino history, and not thinking necessarily about histories of like racism that affect all of us, but in different ways. So yeah, and then also when you think about like speaking of mentors, I think that's also a very huge difference is that there is a lack of like academic mentors, and although there are um, Filipino grad students who do want to reach out to undergrads, so that's why there was this like Filipino PowerPoint party that happened this past weekend. Um, it's like not there isn't that much of a connection between like Filipinos who are studying ethnic studies, like in terms of grad students. Well, for one, there's just very few. And so with that said, there's very little mentorship in that way. But then the mentorship is more so in terms of like alumni networks. So that's something that a lot of these Filipino student orgs are very passionate about, like reaching out to alumni. So it's more so in terms of like professional development and not so much in terms of like education or even thinking about going to grad school um, to pursue like an Asian American studies or Filipino American studies education.
So there's like that huge disconnect in terms of that, and it's
Hmm.
like compared to the West Coast, I mean, I wouldn't consider it like oversaturated, but we have like a surplus of mentors like in like the ethnic studies movement and everything. We
Hmm.
have like people like Dr. Robin Rodriguez. We have is Kevin Adal still teaching, and like he's still, I think I might be thinking of someone else, but like there's a lot of people in SoCal that are like having that same kind of movement to help people like who want to go into like the ethnic studies route. Just
Right.
like it's a lot more accessible in that kind of sense, right?
Yeah. And so with that said, like speaking of mentors, like I've realized like doing these interviews and even just like being involved in Unipro and in the Filipino American community, it's like I feel like I'm often like the first like doctoral student that these people meet. And so it feels like a lot. Like it's great to be able to connect with people. Honestly, like doing these interviews has been like my absolute favorite part of being in this program because I finally get to talk to people that that look like me or that like understand my experiences, even though it might not be exactly the same, or they don't think it's the same because they're from here, from New York. Yeah, like they don't really it's really rare to find for undergrad Filipinos, at least in this area, to connect with like Filipino grad students. Yeah, like it seems I feel like there's more of that pressure, just to like be successful and to like just like go into the job market and thrive in that way, but not so much in terms of like really like um, having that education. So there's that as well. Like I would say there's definitely
The
less
experience
mentorship.
alone sounds. Oh wait, what were you saying?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying there's just definitely less mentorship in that way. And kind of like, I'm connecting with as many Filipino like uh fellow grad students as I can, and trying to like bridge that gap, and connect with undergrads. But it's hard because there's just so few of us.
But it sounds like in the work that you're specifically doing for your dissertation and everything, like
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure that what's like happening right now is going to continue on, whether it's like you or someone else. It's like it sounds like it's setting the foundation of something a lot bigger.
Mhm.
And it's like just going back to the whole interview process and everything. It's like it was very. I'm assuming it was a very healing process for you because you didn't really get to see that like the first time you were in New York, right?
Mhm. Absolutely. Like I get emotional because being from LA County, like, and growing up in a predominantly POC area, like it really messed with me to like be the only Asian American, and actually in two of my classes I was the only Asian in the room. And so when people would, you know, especially to be in education, like, we're seen as this model minority, and the biggest shock for me was to be, even as a Filipino, to be not seen as a person of color. Like, yeah, so my classes weren't predominantly white. There was like, it was pretty racially diverse, but I feel like we were very much being put in like this black and white binary, and I feel like that's kind of like what um seems to be the experience of being in the East Coast. Like, even though it's racially diverse, um yeah, like people just assume that, well, people don't really know what Asians are, but they just assume that Filipinos are like other Asian Americans, and they equate like Asian American success with like, with whiteness in that way. And so that was like something that I really struggled with. And so, um, yeah, and so being able to connect with other Filipinos, it was like other Filipino students, it was really nice to like be able to um, talk through that experience. So even though a lot of my interviewees have been able to find community in college, it was like that was their one chance, or not their one chance, but their first time being able to have that community, versus like being in a high school where they're being in like in K through 12 in their schools as like the only Filipino in the room, or sometimes even the only Asian. And this even happens in New York, like even in Queens, like because schools are like so small, or like some people, a lot of New Yorkers for instance actually went to school in like private Catholic schools. um they're actually like not predominantly Filipino, which is like the hugest shocker for me. But yeah, so I think that's like something that's like really important to like to note.
This is so wild again because there's like the way you're speaking on it again, there's a lot of pockets of Filipinos in New York or just like in the East Coast in general, but like in the places you would expect to find them, like
Hmm.
generally you'd find them like in Catholic schools in like different areas or like different colleges. Like on the West Coast, it's like you don't really see that same similarity
Hmm.
for like Philippines on like on the East Coast and everything. It's just it's such a culture shock. Even though I'm not there, it's just
Yeah.
like the idea of it is very like it's just interesting, but it's also very surprising.
Yeah. um at the same time, I think something that's important to note is that like I feel like, I guess something that makes New York great, I would say, is that despite like how small it is and like how it's like really easy to feel invisible, I feel like Filipino New Yorkers do a great job of like connecting. So like I honestly don't think I would be able to do this kind of research if I, were in California still. Like, I mean, one could say that like, oh, well, there's just a ton of Filipinos anyway, but I mean, really, like, it's so hard to um connect with people outside of like your current institution. So like that was like my experience doing my master's thesis, for instance, when I was like interviewing Filipino community college students or like transfer students. Like I did this whole IRB process so that I could do research at the community college that my siblings actually attend. Um, but then I just could not connect with anyone there. Like I basically interviewed people that I knew that were like transfer students, or like, I interviewed my brother actually. So like I was only able to interview and connect with people that I knew previously versus like in New York, I've been able to connect with um, so many random people. Like I started obviously by interviewing some of my former mentees, people that like really wanted to like support me and and help me with this dissertation. But then like the majority of people that I've met are like through like extended networks that are like that are like not my friends or like especially now because the age gap is very huge now. But like I don't think that would be very possible. I don't think that would be feasible to do in California because you know these orgs are huge and like everyone's just like not at capacity. Like people are just like doing their own thing and it's very very busy. So like I mean, and New York's busy too, but like because this research is so uncommon, especially to focus on Filipino Americans in New York and New Jersey, like that's like why people especially, see this work as important.
Oh, so they see a reason for why this is something that needs to be done because they've never seen something like that before.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas whereas like somewhere on the West Coast, like this work's being done like left and right, so it's like, oh, it's just another person researching and everything. So is that what you meant by like it was hard to connect? Like people already saw it, so it's like they didn't see a point to it, or was it just like it was a hard time like understanding each other? Like
Oh, no,
what
no, no.
exactly do you mean by like having a hard time connecting?
Yeah, I mean, it was literally like hard just to recruit people. Like I only interviewed like 7 people, and then like not all of them were transfer students actually. Like, um, and versus like in New York, like so many. Yeah, so that it was connect in terms of like being able to recruit people basically. Um, and it was hard to recruit because um, there isn't really that tight knit network, um, especially in different like areas of education. So even though there's SC Pasa, like I feel like the chance of me like interviewing a random person, say, at UC San Diego or San Diego State, like that wouldn't be possible because um, these orgs are too large to like have that like to be able to connect in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think there that shows like the contrast between like the West and East, especially since you mentioned find like a few minutes or like 20 minutes ago or
Yeah.
whatever, but that whole tight knit network that's already been established there, like the
Hmm.
whole organization process or yeah, the organization process of how people are able to like run things there, whereas in the West Coast it's very like spread out and it's a lot harder to connect on that kind of level.
Yeah.
So did that whole like you mentioned the whole tight knit network was that one of the factors that helped make this like dissertation slash project a lot easier to put together?
Absolutely. So like being able to know like or to be able to connect with like the people in charge in that network was like a huge like factor, I would say, in being able to like find a lot of my interviewees, but not like all of them. I mean, again, like some of them I found fortunately like randomly like through Twitter or just like people helping circulate my study, but like being able to connect with um this umbrella organization was like very important, and like also again like building rapport with these people. So like I don't think it would have been possible for me to build rapport with like with like SC Pasta, for instance, because it's like because these schools are literally so spread out. And also, yeah, like again, like people are just like not at people are just very overworked and like just doing a lot. Because like these orgs are like diverse, and even again in schools there's like multiple organizations, even at like UC Irvine, for instance, or um especially at UCLA. I can't say much about other schools because I don't know, but like whereas like in New York, like people are either involved for to connect with other Filipinos, or they're just not gonna be involved in the organization. So there isn't like a range of possibilities in terms of student organizing.
The differences and similarities is like it's so vast hearing this, especially
Hmm.
with your project and everything. And considering I've only lived on the West Coast, it's just expanding that knowledge or not knowledge, but like it's expanding this like understanding of how different and how similar we are.
Hmm.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around it right now. It's
Yeah, yeah,
very like my mind's in like a huge thought process right now, so it's like very like hard to digest something that's very different. But like you said, you're in a very interesting position where like you've lived on the West Coast and now you're currently living on the East Coast doing this kind of work, and you're seeing you're basically seeing it with the work you're doing.
yeah. Yeah. But I mean, yeah. And the important thing too for me to emphasize is that like um, even the East Coast is diverse as well. So, I mean, yeah, so that's like really interesting how like people, here are like, "Oh my God, like West Coast is so different." But like even New York is like very, very different from like I would say definitely the rest of the East Coast. Like there's very much like that narrative. So, for instance, like there aren't. So, I mean, you being from San Diego, right? Like, I'm sure there's like a lot of Filipinos that are like involved in the military, but like that's not necessarily the case here. Whereas, like, I'm sure in like Virginia, for instance, like there's like a lot of like, folks who have relatives in the military. So like so that's like something like important to consider. And like again, like Filipinos are everywhere. Like that was at least like my conception when I was in California, and like there, it doesn't really feel like it here, but in a sense, it's like we are here. It's just a lot more dispersed. Um, Even
Mm.
in New York, but at the same time, like I don't know, it's just like there's again so much diversity in the East Coast, and also even within like the New York metro area itself.
And that's just the East Coast too. Like
Yeah.
if we're thinking of it from just like a non-coast perspective, it's probably a lot more different for someone that say like might be from Texas or might be from like Chicago or like
Hmm.
Colorado or something. It's like it's very different. And it's like making me so I do actually have the question of the day. So just to prompt more thinking for the viewers or like the listeners and everything, how do you view or I'm trying to figure out how to word this, but it's on the notion that Filipinos in the West Coast, no coast, East Coast, like everyone's different. So how essentially how do you identify yourself as a Filipino? Because not everyone is the same.
Yeah.
So could you do you have an answer for that question just to give people like an understanding of what to look for or what to think about?
Um. Yeah. I guess. Yeah, like I actually encourage people to like again like not really think so much about like what region you're in, because like honestly like I didn't grow up being like a West Coast Filipino. Like I didn't even like if I did the same interview with people in California, like it wouldn't make sense to like for instance ask someone like, "Oh, what does it mean to be a West Coast Filipino?" Because like I literally never even heard of that phrase until I came here, you know? Or as we know, like California is like huge, so it makes and the West Coast in general, so it doesn't make sense to be able to speak for like Filipinos in Washington or like in Oregon. Like I'm sure it's so different again. So I would encourage people to really think about like, like what was your neighborhood like, or like what is your family's immigration story? And also just think about like what was it like to grow up as a Filipino American? Like did you um, ever feel weird about, your culture? Or did you like, were people ever like, did you ever experience any racial microaggressions based on being Filipino or based on being Asian American? So I guess those are like things that I would encourage to think about in addition to like being in whatever region you're in.
Really just emphasizing that point because everyone there's layers to what
Hmm.
it means to be Filipino or Filipino American, and not everyone's stories are exactly the same. Like someone, like even for me personally, like there are people or there are Filipinos in San Diego, specifically in like the area that I'm in, even though we may have been from the same region or like the same like zip code or everything, a lot of our stories are very different,
Hmm.
especially on how we were raised and everything and how we were brought up. So it's like just keeping in mind that everyone has a different story to tell, and yeah, that's really just like the main thing to keep in mind, that everyone's experiences are very different, but there are a lot of similarities that can tie us together. And that being said, so in terms of what you have planned for after like this dissertation, like what do you have planned for it?
Oh, that's a good question. It's very hard. I mean, honestly, it's very hard to tell like what's going to happen, even right now because of the pandemic that we're in. Um,
Oh,
yeah. So like it's honestly like I'm still working on this dissertation, obviously, but I'm just trying to take things like day by day. And even before the pandemic, I'm like wasn't really sure like what's going to happen after my program because the academic job market, it's very dismal, and it's even worse right now, especially. So
it's a
it,
very rocky thing right
it
now, and
absolutely is.
it's not
But
scary, but it's just like, oh, oof.
yeah, but I would love to, be a professor of Asian American studies. That is like, um, yeah, like in an ideal world, like that's what I would love to do. But I especially would love to be an educator in the New York area. Like as much as I have like a love-hate relationship with New York, I don't want to leave. And especially because ethnic studies isn't really available to folks in New York. Like it's like my passion to help make that accessible for people. So yeah.
And I'm really hoping that happens in the near future because honestly, we we just as like a nation, everything we need more ethnic studies, and just having someone that I know to do that kind of work is a lot more meaningful. And
Hmm.
especially at the work you're doing right now, it's like you're laying the groundwork and everything, and I feel like you're setting a good foundation to like start this off for the next generation.
Hmm.
And that being said, so do you have any other upcoming projects that you want to mention or shout outs that you want to do before we end this interview?
Um. So yeah, this dissertation is basically my project. So that's I would say is upcoming. I would like to do a shout out to um, my friends on Twitter and even outside of Twitter. So as much as there's this like whole notion of like this East Coast West Coast binary, like I've been able to make good friends in New York who um, are, I would say, are very different than like what the stereotypical like East Coast Filipino is, or like non West Coast Filipino is. So again, very thankful for those friends. So shout out to Isa Kahulis, Syra Ukol, and yeah, also the amazing folks that I found on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter.
Yo, shout out to what's your handle so people could follow you?
Oh yeah, my handle is Emilie Tumale. That is spelled Emilie Tumale. And then also if you want to follow me on Instagram, where it's more personal stuff but less academic. Um, but I do post milestones. My Instagram handle is Miss Emily, so that is MISS.EMILIE.
Heck yeah, shout out to your followers on Twitter, on Instagram. And with that being said, thank y'all for listening to this episode of the Pilipinx American Stories podcast, and we will see you on the next one.